let's design a wilderness adventure. I've previously done a how I design a dungeon adventure. This is the sequel, how I design a wilderness adventure. And it's probably best to start with defining what a wilderness adventure is. And I think, generally speaking, what I think of as a wilderness adventure has three qualities, three distinctions. It is distinguished by its scale, by its objective, and by the types of challenges it has. So, scale. The first thing is it has a difference of scale to dungeon adventures, which are contained in a small area. Most wilderness adventures take place over many miles or even scores of miles, hundreds of miles, rather than, say, an acre or less. There are exceptions, of course, and there'll be exceptions to all of what I say, but say UK1 Beyond the Crystal Cave is a wilderness adventure, but the wilderness is incredibly small. And it is still a wilderness adventure in terms of the kind of thing it is, the kind of challenges it presents, but it's not a big scope. Classic wilderness adventures for scale, at the one end you might think of something like B10, Night's Dark Terror, or perhaps the first half of Lost Caverns of Sahuagin, large wilderness areas where you're going all over the place to find things. And at the smaller end, something like UK1. Also, the objectives are often different. So in a dungeon, you might need to defeat a bad guy, or you might need to find an item in the dungeon. Those are classic reasons you get sent there, or rather rumours you might pick up, or whatever else. And of course, and particularly, the acquisition of large amounts of treasure is also a perfectly classic one that is very dungeon focused from the first fantasy campaigns. However, and that can be the case in a wilderness adventure too, but I think in wilderness campaigns you often find a slightly different dynamic of what you're doing there. So you have a lot of space that needs to be explored. Many things may be hidden in it. You need to search around it. Though Dolmenwood, the setting, isn't what I'd call an adventure, the idea that there are lots of hidden features and hexes is a very wilderness adventure kind of thing, and you can make adventures work based on that. Like, for instance, in my Dolmenwood campaign, the search for the various shrines of the saints to be cleansed and restored to working order. That's very much a searching around all the hexes and finding hidden things kind of an adventure or side plot. The particular task might be to travel to a distant locale quickly. That's the sort of, you're almost on a timer, or things are happening. You've got to get to this place and solve this problem. And it could be perhaps a fetch quest, but not a fetch quest where you're going to the bottom of the dungeon to find the one thing, but the sort of thing, you see this with UK1. You go around and you find different items that you need to solve a problem, or to answer a puzzle. And though you can do that in a dungeon, absolutely, the idea that you have to go over a trackless area where you can't simply say, we'll turn left down the corridor, where you're using some sort of higher scale map, that's very wilderness adventure-y. And finding the kinds of challenges do differ. Of course, there are monsters and there may be traps as well, depending on the kind of thing. But rather than focusing the challenge on hostile dungeon inhabitants and particular complex interactions of traps and environment, because the environment is so much wider and larger, and because the individual spots of travel may be slightly less fraught, the challenges are different. It's more about needing to traverse large distances, manage your food resources, manage to sleep regularly, and things like that. Monsters are operating on the random encounter basis rather than on the wandering monster basis. It's not patrols that might hit you in the dungeon so much as, though there may be sentient people out in the wilderness, but rather that dynamic of the wandering monster and the broader environment, the more varied terrain. So I think those are some differences to the wilderness adventure that mean that its design considerations are different. If you design a wilderness adventure where you're expecting your players to spend days travelling over this vast expanse of forest, but it fundamentally feels like a dungeon adventure, it feels as if they're choosing left or right at the crossroads, and the sorts of challenges and treasures are basically the same, then I think you've probably got something wrong. It may be a fun adventure, so in the end, don't listen to me, listen to the table, listen to your instincts. But I think if your large-scale wilderness adventure is the same as your small-scale dungeon adventure, you're probably missing out on a unique experience that you and the players could have. So I'm going to, and this is just how I do things, and it's certainly not the best or the only way, but we're going to do a wilderness adventure my way. Now, what we've got is the deep farms. Now, the deep farms, this is, as with my dungeon adventure, I've just taken a piece of my work that I've already got that I haven't developed, and we're going to develop it more. The deep farms is one of the grottos of the Fallen Feyarchy. That's a setting I've been working on slowly for the past year and a bit, or about a year, which is a fallen elven empire, which is in a set of sea grottos in a tropical area, and some are inhabited and fallen to the outside world. You know, they're inhabited by normal humans, demi-humans, things like that. Many are still hidden behind magical glamour, and some of the original inhabitants survive in a degraded state, or at least in a more fragile state. New inhabitants have moved in and caused problems as well in various ways. And so it's the Fallen Empire trope for a setting, but with the twist that it's got lots of water in it, and that it, how can I say, and there's a few other features in it. For instance, that every area has things you can repair, you know, magical machinery you can repair. You can rebuild this environment, you can make it better. So there's an upward lift theme to it. Also the idea that it draws heavily on various Fey cultures. So you've got sea elves and tritons who are still living in the inner grottos. Now we're out on the outermost grotto here, the deep farms, which is, you can see 4 sentences. All it says here is the glamorous fallen is no longer hidden from the outside world, is inhabited by Locathah. They were the imperial population of the area, and Sahuagin raiders are also there. They've broken in from the outside, and they've taken the talisman of Al-Akbar, which is a first edition Dungeon Master's Guide item. And there's also, in terms of, as well as, well, what you hear there, deep farms, there is a food farming operation there, or was at least. There are also genetic labs. So that's all we know now. And the reason I'd say this is going to be a wilderness adventure rather than a dungeon adventure, rather than like, oh, so this is going to be just the genetic labs, is it, with Sahuagin as one faction and Locathah as another faction, is that if you imagine the grottos, they're spanning many miles, and each grotto is kind of dotted along there, and maybe a mile or two across at most. Many will be smaller than that, or some will be smaller than that. At the same time, the deep farms is spreading around the outside and is a lot larger, or at least could be a lot larger if we wanted it to be. And I think it's a good opportunity in the setting to do something different. The 3 or 4, I guess there's 5 grottos. I've done lots of work on 3, which are basically finished. One is a wilderness area and mangrove swamp. One is a village, basically, the human starting village. One is a dungeon environment, and a couple are mini urban environments with kind of a mixture of dungeon and small outside environment. So this is a wilderness environment, but very different to that mangrove swamp where you're searching around through the swamp and you're getting lost, and it's got particular kinds of particularly botanical challenges. There's ruins, there's weird humanoid tribes. Here you're out on the ocean. You've got to have, and at this point, you know, I'm assuming players will often, when they get to this, they'll be 4th or 5th level, perhaps, or 3rd level at least. They've got a boat, they're going around, so there's that aquatic side of things. That's its own challenge, of course, which I won't fully be able to cover here. But they're going to have to go between the different locations, managing the threats from the Sahuagin, from being out in the ocean, so as to discover information and do whatever they're there to do. Now, you can, obviously, it's an adventure, so you need hooks in, but that's a meta question. The location you can design separately, really, from the hooks. In fact, I think usually adventures are better if they can at some level separate the two and have the hooks as things you can just throw in as you choose, rather than integral to the way the adventure is written. If the adventure is a location, it's usually easier to do different things with, to fit into different campaigns. So the deep farms, You may go there to fix the genetic labs. You may go there because the Sahuagin raiders are getting bold and attacking other allied settlements. You may go there just because there's cool treasure there or you're interested. But the point is that you go there and there's this spread out aquatic environment, some above water, some below water, and you're going to need to traverse those challenges to get to those places. It will presumably include mini dungeons, the genetic labs for instance, and it will include, I guess, at least 1 or 2 Locathah villages, but nonetheless, it's a wilderness adventure can include those smaller things, I think. So what we're going to do next, the next job, is to draw a point crawl map. I've gone for point crawl rather than hex crawl. You could go either way, and I think there's as good an argument to go for a hex crawl because it's aquatic. Tightly measuring distance is a good way of disciplining players in some ways, and I suppose it might be tempting. This is the kind of thing I could end up if I made a big hex map of the whole Grottoes. I might do it that way. I might turn this back into a hex map. I don't think I want a hex map for the Grottoes, so it doesn't matter. So it's a point crawl. You're going from node to node through either a fixed or an unfixed distance between. So it could be that every point, I think it's is it half a mile or something in Slumbering Ursine Dunes, something like that. Doesn't really matter what it is, but the idea that you're spending a certain amount of time and it covers a roughly similar amount of distance. Or it could be that there's a flux space in between, so it could be that technically it's longer or shorter, but more or less the same stuff happens in that distance. I think we're going to go for fixed time and fixed distance, etc. So essentially, so that the resource management side of the game is predictable. This is first edition setting, and I think that's a game, much like lots of basic as well, that resource management matters. Not all, but lots of. Now, how many points do you need in a point crawl? Well, we could go for 60. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You know, you think that's pushing the mega dungeon side of that idea, isn't it? If you've got 60 fully fleshed out locations of differing sizes, that's equivalent to, could be 200 or 300 rooms. This is not going to be that big. I think, so like one of the dungeons, it has about 30 rooms. For instance, that's on the small side for the setting. The other wilderness adventure I've fully written out has kind of 6 or 7 large locations. So here, I think 10 points seems about right. Now, I'm going to draw, as previously, very, very basically, in the simplest way possible. But so there's a point. Okay, that's how we're going to do them. So we want about 10 points, and you want to have it so that the nodes link up in interesting ways, and you can find perfectly plausible reasons why you're channeling players in particular directions that are realistic in the world. Like there's an enormous array of rocks somewhere. That's actually a cool thing in itself, isn't it? You know, they can't sail through there because there is a wide barrier of rocks that is impassable to their boats. So let's say that's going to be the genetic labs, isn't it? Just to start off very, very obviously based on our prompt. And there we go, genetic labs. So that's simple. We have, that's not the starting location, of course, but we have a place where we know that's an important place that presumably the Sahuagin have got control of. On their raids further into the Grottoes, they're basing themselves out of there. My idea for these Sahuagin is that they're a sort of military or militaristic command economy, people, government, and this contrasts to the organisation of everyone else. The Locathah, for instance, let's do it. 1 second. So yeah, we've got some more relevant information about the setting in one of the master documents here, which is mostly actually about their currency. But the Locathah use platinum pieces, electrum pieces, silver, copper, and pearls. Their unique currency is pearls, whilst the aquatic elves and the Tritons don't use any other currency other than the ancient elven currency. The Sahuagin they're societally developed, but they do not use money, being a full-blown militarised command economy. It's sort of military communist fantasy. So they're going to be based out of that one place. I also am reminded that the genetic labs are in fact called the enlightening labs. They're places where the ancient elves would improve species and enlighten species. And obviously you can imagine there being some madness going on in that. So the genetic labs, I'm imagining that's going to be a multi-level dungeon, Sahuagin based presumably upstairs as we would think of it, and then in some of the areas, some flooded, some not. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on. Let's get some close nodes in. I think it's probably reasonable to think of these as like, you could have them being 10 miles apart or something, couldn't you? So that you know how to measure. I'd need to think more about the exact scale of things to make sure that worked. But if you essentially had this distance being 40 miles wide, or 30 miles wide, and then the grottos spaced out. So if you had the map, the grottos would be spaced above this map along here, and you'd be able to kind of identify where they were. How many have we got there? We've got 8. Let's put another one in there, another one in there. So that's 10 points, all fairly arbitrary, not very neat, but you get the picture. Let's get a decent brush for our purposes here. What a terrible choice of brush. I'm just going to draw in the links between the points here. Now, as I said, they don't all have to link to each other in an obvious way. It doesn't have to be that there's one outer layer that links into the inner layer, which links equally into the kind of the innermost layer. The genetic labs doesn't have to be reachable from everywhere, basically. So, for instance, we've got 2 ways into the genetics lab there now. That one is coming from there. So there we go. You've got 2 routes that are absolute from the outside. We're going to have to kind of link that back to there, and maybe that back to there, and that back to there. I'll explain what I've just done there in a moment. One more to the genetic labs. So here, let's talk about that. That's not necessarily what it'll stay, but here the idea is that the genetic labs, which is the single biggest location in this wilderness adventure, is not easy to reach. You have to go via multiple points, whichever direction you come from. If you come from the northeast, you go through 2 points. If you come from the north, you have to go through 3. If you come from the west, you have to go through 2 points. And those links to the outside, that's roughly how I'm imagining the sea lanes are going to be, or which is the first point you bump into, depending on which direction you come from. Now, of course, I think that might be the kind of thing where I either need to make up lots of barriers, or shift this map slightly so those points are more obviously outside, or make it more flexible so you can get to more places. But actually, you want point crawls particularly to be less flexible. You're using that format partly so you channel player movement more effectively, so that they have to face particular kinds of problems. And the terrain, therefore, needs to suit that to make it naturalistic. As I say, this is an argument where you could say, well, no, it's better to have a hex map for a sea adventure, of course. But as I say, I think this will work. Now, what's next? As I say, there'll be some barriers in between here. I think you could certainly imagine this being the, we're saying about having a barrier of rocks that you can't sail through. That seems like a good one to have there. Makes sense why you're always approaching from the outside there. Now, what about these other points? What am I going to put here? I think we need at least 2 Locathah locations, because though you could say, well, you only need 1 village for them to access, your players to access and be based in whilst they're in this area. At the same time, I think that, basically I think that's vulnerable to, I don't know, feeling strangely unnaturalistic. If this is where the Locathah have lived, if this is where they farmed, then I think it makes sense that particularly 2,000 years ago during the Empire, it makes sense they may be more spread out. Of course, they needn't be. But what you could have then is up here, so more close to the central grottos, the ones that haven't been breached, where the glamour hasn't fallen, you could have skeptical Locathah village. So you could have a significant village of Locathah who don't necessarily want to see you. And they're straight away. You just get straight away to them. Here, let's say, you could have beleagured Locathah farm. So the Locathah there are not necessarily skeptical of anyone coming this direction. They're not straight away. They're not the first point you meet. They want your help, but they also need your help. They're not in a position to just make everything easy for you. So that's going to be both of those, because Locathah are able to be both. They're basically amphibious. They're fish, but they're amphibious fish. They're lungfish, basically. So the skeptical Locathah village will be larger and have more things you can do there. And yet some of it will be below water, some above water, because they would have had to deal with their high elf and other allied peoples beforehand. It couldn't all be below land with just, periscope above. It'd need to be mixed. The beleaguered Locathah farm, similarly, because they will have had to have potentially some contact, will be mixed. And I think I like the idea that the Locathah like being in the air as well as, and I think that is perfectly canonical in depiction. So that has fewer resources at the farm, but they are much happier to see you. They're not as xenophobic. None of these guys are going to be as xenophobic as the way I've seen the Sea Elves, who basically, they kind of now think they're in charge, because there's not really any High Elves left who used to co-rule with them. And they don't really like the idea of people coming in and ruining stuff more than it already has been ruined. Understandable in a way, but nonetheless they'll be very antagonistic to players who are not careful. These Locathah, they're not going to be that negative. Now there is a submarine subway system up in the kind of main grottos, and so I think how about a subway hub here, not in one of the settlements, but the kind of thing where things were going to be repaired and so on. So there's and you may have this village may have a ruined station, and then that same ruined line will go. It partially works further up in the grottos, but here it'll be ruined. But it could have. In fact, how about we make that slightly easier by to talk about by drawing it in. Let's have. So it's going to come in here. Oh, again, not a very useful one, is it? It's going to come in there and then come through to here, and then so that's the subway line. That's ruined. You can fix up the subway line in the way I've imagined it, so perhaps that's something players would do as well. So subway hub, skeptical Locathah villages. We probably want some, because this is a wilderness crawl and it's in the sea, we probably want some terrain-based problems, let's say. So this approach could have some Sargasso, I guess. Or no, actually, I think. Why would you not go that way? That's an interesting question. Well, let's say over here. Let's start here. This is going to be a ruined lighthouse. So that's again, in this case, a largely above ground location, which I think is going to have Sahuagin in it. And so you've got them players being channeled through if they come from the northeast, which is the way, that's where the human village that you'd start in is. So if you'd come this way, you have essentially a combat encounter to start with, unless you manage to sneak around. And the ruined lighthouse could be with sort of a set of inner coral atolls. So you're funneled toward it unless you very intentionally seek to go past, and the Sahuagin can still see you and chase you. So you've got the ruined lighthouse. You then can get through to the Locathah farm, who, as you can see, is now stuck between Sahuagin outposts. Then what about over here? This way, yeah, we'll have the Sargasso, the idea of a kind of area of Sargasso here. So that is then a environmental problem. So there, in the north, coming from the north, you've got these skeptical Locathah, which is a social problem. It would be a really great base, but they don't really want you to stop there or travel through there. There's the ruined lighthouse over in the east, which you're channeled toward, and even if you try to avoid, the Sahuagin might spot you if you're not careful. It depends how you're travelling, of course. And so there's more of a combat focus. And over in the west, you've got an environmental problem, which is going to make you very slow. It could reasonably take days to get through if you're having to oar your way through or cut the Sargasso. And I think it'd be good to have some, but that will probably need to have its own mini environmental tables, like its own encounter table and some social encounters and stuff. Because I think the idea that there's other people there who you can talk to in a friendly fashion sounds quite fun for that as an environment on the point crawl. Now, what else? We've got, so remember, we've got 4 locations left here. Again, another environmental one would probably be fitting, because especially because I think it's aquatic, so you're less likely to have, and the environmental ones are not going to be a dryad grove and a frozen area with snowmen. You're more likely to have specifically, well, you're going to have aquatic issues, but issues which are how to put it? They're less spectacle and more direct effect. So here, let's have this be steaming gazers. So that is a field of steaming gazers. That is just a danger. So the Sargasso Sea slows you down. The gazers, if you want to go that way, if you're trying to go around this way, it's just a problem. You know, that's dangerous. But of course, it may be the way you want to go, especially if you clear the lighthouse and you've linked up the Locathah again. So it might be a more convenient way if you're coming from the north to do that. Now, this one in the corner that I've stuck at right at the bottom with just 2 links, one from the genetic labs. This might actually be the most fun or interesting location to send your players. It's the hardest place on the map to get to. It doesn't need to be the most important, but I think the idea of sticking in, as with secret rooms and dungeons, I think in wilderness is out of the way corners are sometimes the reward function. And so what might that be there? Well, you could have, I'm trying to think, would it be better to have a controversial problem area, like it's a Locathah graveyard? Do you want to go there and rob all the stuff of the good guys that you may have been relying on to help you? Or could it be something perhaps more historic? I think it's tough, given that this is a high fantasy, classical high fantasy setting in lots of ways. Having the major treasure bonus area be a place where you loot all your friends' dead relatives is perhaps less exciting, though amusing as a concept, of course, in game terms. But perhaps instead it should be a ruined submarine villa. So what we're talking about here is the old Feyarchs had some houses out here, and this is an enormous, relatively speaking, villa that has sunken. You know, it's whatever its systems were have collapsed. Maybe it's inhabited by sea elves, maybe it's just had its magic collapse. So here, the genetic labs is this weird, slightly sci-fi inspired, there's enemies at the gates, but there's also weird monsters below, and there's all these things gone wrong. Whereas the submarine villa is more, the challenge is it's aquatic and underwater, so your players are going to need their rings of underwater breathing and underwater action and things like that. But also, ring of free action, but also they're going to, it's going to be more of a classic mid-level dungeon crawl, going around finding all the cool stuff. So I think that's a nice idea. And that's, as I say, it's in the corner. They don't have to go there for the larger political and technological discoveries, but if they're there for treasure, it's a good place to go. Now, and that's a second, you've got kind of 2 or 3 dungeony areas, one of which is very small, the Ruined Lighthouse, and then 2 of which could be medium-sized. 2 last locations. This one here, south of the subway hub, this needs to be some kind of obstacle. Not a natural obstacle, perhaps, but it needs to be some kind of obstacle, because otherwise players can come to the Locathah village, make friends with the Locathah, go over the subway hub, say we're not interested in that ruin today, keep going and just swim round to the central location. And so what is another, here's where I suddenly show how little I've thought about this beforehand. What's another aquatic problem, particularly natural problem that could happen? One, except I don't really want it to be natural, because we've got the Sargasso, we've got the steaming gazers. So what else? What could be another sort of problem? Well, you could have that be because this is a tropical place and there are reefs close to shore. It could be a magical reef, so there's some kind of problem. So reefs are dangerous to sail over anyway, but also there's weird stuff there. Magical reef is part natural obstacle that you have to sail around carefully, but you can probably do that. But it's the other weird stuff that pops up from it that's the problem, or perhaps the opportunity, because of course I think in old school play problems need to be opportunities most of the time. So one last location. This is an elbow piece, isn't it? It's in the corner of nowhere, which allows you kind of to slip round to the villa and therefore to the genetic labs if you want to avoid the reef, which may be a sensible thing coming from that direction. So what could that last location be? How about this is a defunct farm? This is a defunct farm, so the Locathah don't use it anymore. Perhaps they did before the Sahuagin started raiding, so it may be only a few years defunct, or it may be longer term. But either way, there are presumably some of the kind of special, it could have things that half work. It could have, if they have helper animals, those helper animals could still be there. You could see some things that could happen with that as a small outdoor wilderness area equivalent, but in this wider wilderness point crawl. So, what we want next is, let's see if I can actually resize things in a way that is okay for this. Well, that will help. So, we need to put these spaces on. I tend to letter outdoor areas. So, Locathah village is A. And subway hub, deep farm subway hub, is B. Magical reef is C. Or polluted reef, we call it, is C. And what else do we want? We can call the Sargasso D. We'll call the abandoned farm E. F can be the ruined Feyarchy villa, and G can be the enlightening labs. That's what they're called. And then what's on the other side? We've got steaming geysers. So H, steaming geysers. I, ruined lighthouse. J is going to be beleagured farm. I think there's one more, wasn't there? Or is that it? Is that 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to give us one sentence descriptions here. Farms and so they're skeptical of outsiders. They've got farms and traders. That's the Locathah village. That's the very brief, the half sentence description. The deep farm subway hub, ruined but with salvageable tech. And what's something else that, but probably you want to have that as a small outdoor wilderness area, albeit underwater. In fact, let's mark that as underwater because it matters for the design purposes later. Ruined but with salvageable tech inhabited by dangerous monster. So there's really valuable stuff down there. You go down there with your underwater breathing and free action, but there's also some kind of Jaws-ish or perhaps more Stalker-ish problem there. The polluted reef, magically polluted, and slight sailing hazard with weird monsters and events. Sargasso, slow to travel through. So rather than it being like, you can travel over each point, every other point you can travel between in an hour, the Sargasso is like 8 hours, something like that. Mixture of social and combat encounters, micro-locations. We could map the Sargasso. I think it'd probably be better to use it almost as its own flux space where you're rolling and seeing who you bump into. Helper animals still present. Food gone. Because I guess algae gone wild. That's the abandoned farm. The ruined Feyarchy villa is underwater, but is otherwise traditional dungeon with lots of treasure. It's a ruined dungeon. I think that's one thing. There are also subtypes of these. So for dungeons, you definitely think of ruins versus forts versus caverns. Those are all very different kinds of dungeons, aren't they? Versus temples, the Temple of the Grottoes. Enlightening labs, part flooded. Upper levels equals Sahuagin base, lower levels equals sci-fantasy madness. Steaming geysers, hazard. Ruined lighthouse is going to be Sahuagin outpost. Will pursue ships. And the beleagured farm, Locathah settlement, need help. Open to alliance. So that is 10 locations fairly quickly knocked out. Some of which you can see are going to require a lot more work than others. For instance, the steaming geysers and even the Sargasso, which needs its own table, they're probably a lot simpler for me to do. And the polluted reef as well. A lot simpler in one way for me to do than the mini dungeons, the genetic labs and the ruined villa. They're different tasks, of course, but basically mapping out a 10 or 15 room dungeon, even though it's a small dungeon at that point, or 20 or 25 or 30 if it's medium, is nonetheless, there's a lot more thought going into the physical dynamics there, as well as the design elements, than just making tables. So a cool table for the Sargasso will be much quicker than the equivalent number of decisions made for a dungeon. But yeah, that the variety in a point crawl, in a wilderness adventure in general, is part of the fun. I think dungeons can get away and often benefit from a certain amount of thematic unity. Thematic coherence certainly is necessary, and a high degree of unity is usually good, because it also makes when stuff is weird and different more valuable. But with wildernesses, you can afford, even while you're keeping that coherence, to have more variety, more things that players will do, and often will reach because if you're thinking they're going to do a couple of these per session, or several per session, if they're not going into the dungeons themselves, then the idea that there's more variety is part of how you highlight the difference in space. So the idea they go to one place and it's a ruined lighthouse and it's got 6 rooms in it or something, and they're tough enough, so they beat the Sahuagin and they take it over. But then there's the steaming geysers to deal with, and then there's the skeptical Locathah. They're all very different and feel far apart. I think that's part of the illusion you're trying to create, part of the story you're trying to tell with a wilderness adventure. Probably the last thing I will do here is let's just remind ourselves that we need an encounter table, and throw some ideas on it. I'll probably do a second part of this video where I dig in and iterate a lot of this stuff, but for now I'll just put a few ideas in the encounter table. So you're going to roll each time or each point traveled, I guess is the way to put it. Essentially, I think that's the same in Slumbering Ursine Dunes as well. You roll when you cross the point, when you're travelling along that rough line. And this is aquatic, so you're going to think like that. So Sahuagin, dolphins might help you. Locathah, so that you've got a couple of sentients there who are the local sentients. You've got an interesting animal. You could have some giant lampreys. You could have wereshark and minions. So a wereshark raider pops up with some minions. I've got a particular encounter design I've used elsewhere. I'll probably put in there, which I think would fit the setting fine. And do you know what we also probably need? A weather table. I'm not going to do that now, but just you need to know what the weather's like, don't you? Wereshark and minions. That is 5. We're probably going to want at least 10 encounters, probably 12 actually, so that there's enough variety, because you're going over those a lot of times. Maybe even you could even nest it, so you have fish, types of fish as an entire entry, and then you have sub entries. Let's have one problem with aquatic adventures, to state the obvious, is that if you're on a ship and stuff is in the water, it's not very good at threatening you, and so you sometimes have to think, how does that become interesting? So having a whirlpool is an obvious thing. And is there one more thing I can think about now? I had it on the tip of my tongue. But yeah, that's enough for now. Few encounter ideas that, put it this way, if I was forced to run this next week and I had 20 minutes or half an hour to prepare 1 or 2 extra bits, probably around the dungeons and the village, I'd be able to, and I'd have some ideas about how to run it. It's not quite ready to go to alpha at the table. It probably needs doubling in length, but it's not far from that. And so I'm also not guaranteeing it's any good. It might turn out to not be very successful in practice. And certainly the lack of detail on some of the cool interactive parts of the world, like the enlightening lab itself, are things that would be annoying in practice in a campaign game. But nonetheless, there we are. That's how I design wilderness adventures, or at least this wilderness adventure. As I say, I've also I have done other ways of doing it. I think these sorts of rough point crawls, whether official or unofficial, are a good way to do a lot of constrained wilderness adventures where you're wanting to create nodes. You use hexes, I think, for the purpose of the idea of the trackless waste, where people have no idea what they're doing, which is fun. Sometimes, if you can get it working right, your players will enjoy that. Obviously, they may think it sucks if they don't know what they're doing. Anyway, that's how I do it. How do you do it? How do you design wilderness adventures? Or what are some, how have you failed at it? You know, that's always a valuable discussion too. What are your favourite wilderness adventures? Tell me in the comments. And as I say, I'll return to this topic another time to iterate on this adventure. Till next time.